In the early 1940s, Kobe was one of the main gateways between the Japanese home islands and the wider world. As the sixth largest city in Japan, it had a population of roughly 1 million and formed part of the Hanshin industrial region on the eastern shore of the inland sea. The port handled large volumes of merchant shipping and naval traffic, supported major shipyards and marine engine plants, and was tied into a wider network of steel, machinery, rubber, railway equipment, and ordnance factories. National highways and rail lines converged in its business districts, making the city not only a harbor, but also a logistics node for the Japanese war economy. Urban development before the Pacific War had left Kobe highly vulnerable to fire. Residential neighborhoods were dominated by closely spaced wooden houses with light internal partitions, often built along narrow streets. Unlike some other ports, Kobe relied on only 3 reservoirs for its water supply, and its firefighting services had limited equipment and pumping capacity. These conditions meant that, in the event of a major incendiary attack, large areas of the city could be exposed to rapidly spreading fires that exceeded local control. Japan entered the war against the United States and Britain in December 1941, with a merchant fleet of just under 6 million gross tons. Supported by extensive shipbuilding capacity in ports such as Kobe and nearby Osaka. Maintaining sea lines of communication to Southeast Asia was central to the imperial strategy, as these routes carried oil, bauxite, rubber, and other raw materials needed to sustain industrial production and military operations. As the war progressed, Allied submarines and aircraft sank a growing proportion of Japanese shipping, increasing the importance of surviving ports and shipyards and placing additional pressure on hubs like Kobe to repair hulls, build new vessels, and channel remaining cargoes inland. On the American side, the concept of using heavy bombers to attack Japan's industrial base began to take shape in 1943. The 20th Air Force was created in April 1944 to control the new B-29 Superfortress units, with General Henry H. Arnold retaining direct command from Washington. Initial operations under XX Bomber Command used China-based airfields supplied via India in Operation Matterhorn, but these missions were constrained by distance, logistics, and weather. Strategic planners concluded that sustained pressure on Japanese industry would require large-scale operations from bases closer to the home islands. This requirement drove the American campaign to seize the Mariana Islands in mid-1944. Once Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were secured, construction began on very large airfields intended to host hundreds of B-29s with direct reach to Japan's main cities. 21st Bomber Command, operating from these islands, became the main instrument for a systematic air offensive against the Japanese home islands from late 1944 onward. Japanese air units attempted to disrupt these bases with raids from Iwo Jima and other locations, but losses in aircraft and crews limited their ability to sustain offensive operations against the new bomber fields. American targeting doctrine evolved as intelligence on Japanese industry accumulated. Surveys indicated that a substantial share of armaments, aircraft components, and other war material was produced not only in large plants, but also in dense belts of small workshops embedded in residential districts. Experiments at WWII Proving Ground, where clusters of Japanese-style buildings were constructed and exposed to various incendiary munitions, showed that napalm-filled M69 bomblets could ignite and sustain fires in such environments. This research underpinned a shift from high-altitude precision attacks on individual plants toward area attacks intended to create firestorms in urban industrial zones. For Japanese authorities, the prospect of large-scale air raids on the home islands posed both military and social challenges. During the first years of the Pacific War, civil defense planning emphasized neighborhood firefighting and public exhortations to remain at posts rather than evacuation. As defeats accumulated in 1942 to 1943, policy gradually shifted. From December 1943, the government encouraged voluntary evacuation of children, the elderly, and some women to rural areas, followed in 1944 by organized school-based evacuations. By mid-1944, hundreds of thousands of children and dependents had left major cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe, though many working-age adults remained in urban areas to staff factories, docks, and transport services. These measures did not fundamentally change the physical vulnerability of the cities. Kobe's industrial functions, concentration of transport infrastructure, and highly combustible housing stock made it appear prominently in American target lists, alongside Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. For Japanese planners, the city was both an essential asset for shipping and industry, and a potential liability if destroyed, because its loss would further disrupt already strained logistics. For American planners, the same characteristics marked Kobe as a candidate for attacks aimed at reducing Japan's remaining shipping capacity, weakening industrial output, and testing the effectiveness of large-scale incendiary raids against a major port city. The opening phase of air attacks on Kobe began not in 1945, but in April 1942, when the city was included as one of the secondary targets of the Doolittle raid. On April 18th, a single B-25 Mitchell reached Kobe and dropped 4 500-pound bombs on industrial districts. Damage was limited, and Japanese reports at the time treated the incident as a minor incursion rather than the start of a sustained campaign. Yet, for American planners, the raid demonstrated that even the inner zones of the Japanese home islands were reachable, while for Japanese civil and military authorities, it exposed the existence of gaps in early warning and air defense arrangements along parts of the inland sea coast. In the following 2 years, Kobe did not experience large-scale bombing. Japanese air defenses were reorganized under the Homeland Air Defense Command, which divided responsibility among regional air armies and expanded anti-aircraft artillery around major ports and industrial zones. In theory, Kobe fell within a layered system of coastal observation posts, radar stations, searchlights, fighters, and heavy guns. In practice, the priority of resources went to areas judged most likely to face carrier-based raids, such as the Kanto and Kyushu regions, and the city's defenses remained constrained by limited numbers of modern radar sets and interceptor aircraft. The arrival of B-29 units in the Mariana Islands in late 1944 created the conditions for a new phase. 21st Bomber Command, under the 20th Air Force, was tasked with strategic attacks on Japan's industrial system. Initial missions in November and December 1944 focused on precision attacks against major aircraft plants and engine works, but weather, mechanical issues, and jet stream winds at high altitude reduced effectiveness. Kobe's factories and port facilities were listed as potential targets, yet in this early period, the city remained in reserve, while Tokyo, Nagoya, and other centers with major aviation production were attacked first. The first large B-29 raid on Kobe took place on the 4th of February 1945, acting on the results of incendiary tests at WWII Proving Ground, where Japanese-style urban districts had been constructed and burned under controlled conditions. Major General Curtis LeMay authorized an experimental incendiary attack to assess how such weapons would perform over an actual Japanese city. 69 B-29s of 21st Bomber Command were dispatched against Kobe, carrying clusters of M69 napalm bomblets and related incendiary munitions. Flying at high altitude, they encountered winds and cloud that limited bombing accuracy, but still started fires that destroyed or damaged approximately 1,039 buildings in parts of the urban area. For Japanese defenders, the 4th of February raid constituted the first indication that Kobe was now within range of a sustained long-range bombing campaign. Observers on the ground recorded the pattern of incendiary clusters, the spread of fires, and the response time of local firefighting units. Anti-aircraft batteries engaged the incoming bombers, but claims of B-29s destroyed could not be confirmed from American loss records. Civil defense organizations, which had previously focused on drills and small-scale incidents, now faced extended fire lines and heavy smoke. Local authorities used the experience to refine blackout procedures, shelter usage, and the deployment of neighborhood fire brigades equipped with buckets, hand pumps, and small motorized engines. In Washington and on Saipan, mission reports from the first Kobe raid were examined alongside data from attacks on other cities. Intelligence officers plotted the burned districts on urban maps and compared them with industrial surveys to estimate the effect on war-related production. The reports concluded that incendiary bombing could ignite large areas even when bombing accuracy was reduced by altitude and weather, especially in cities with dense wooden housing. However, they also noted that Kobe's port and some key factories had not yet been seriously damaged. These findings would inform the planning of subsequent operations, in which Kobe would be grouped with Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya in a series of larger nighttime firebombing raids designed to exploit the observed vulnerabilities on a much greater scale. Strategic planning for the renewed bombing of Kobe took shape in early 1945, when American commanders reassessed the entire air campaign against Japan. After mixed results from high-altitude precision attacks, the 20th Air Force issued a new directive in February that broadened objectives from factories alone to urban industrial areas. The goal was to reduce Japan's capacity to continue the war by destroying production centers, transport hubs, and shipbuilding facilities embedded in cities. Kobe, as a major port with shipyards, machine works, and dense belts of small workshops, was identified as one of 4 priority urban targets alongside Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. Within 21st Bomber Command, planners translated these broad objectives into specific target systems around Kobe. Intelligence from aerial photography, pre-war trade directories, and captured documents was used to map shipyards, marine engine plants, railway yards, warehouses, oil storage, and power facilities. Analysts also plotted clusters of small and medium-sized workshops that produced components for the Navy, Army, and merchant fleet. The plan did not distinguish between large standalone plants and integrated industrial districts. The working assumption was that a sufficiently intense incendiary attack on the urban fabric would disrupt the total output of the city's war-related economy, including firms that could not be precisely located. Operational planning had to reconcile these economic goals with the technical performance of B-29s. Experience over Tokyo and Nagoya showed that strong jet stream winds at high altitude scattered bomb patterns and limited the effectiveness of precision bombing. General Curtis LeMay therefore approved a change in tactics. Large formations of B-29s would fly at lower altitudes by night, carrying almost entirely incendiary loads, and attack city areas marked by Pathfinder aircraft rather than individual factories. For Kobe, this meant focusing not on 1 or 2 major plants, but on a rectangular zone encompassing docklands, business districts, railway lines, and adjacent housing, with the expectation that fires would merge into continuous burn areas. Logistics were central to these plans. A typical mission from the Mariana Islands to Kobe implied a round trip of more than 4,800 kilometers and flight times of 13 to 15 hours. Each bomber required large quantities of aviation fuel, spare engines, and maintenance hours between sorties. Ground crews on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam prepared bomb loads composed mainly of M69 napalm bomblets packed into cluster casings, supplemented by larger incendiary bombs for roof penetration. Tankers and cargo ships maintained a constant flow of fuel and munitions to the island bases, while engineers worked to keep runways and service facilities operational under heavy use. The decision to remove some defensive armament from B-29s on certain missions was partly driven by the need to increase bomb load within these logistical constraints. On the Japanese side, planning efforts were shaped by the same recognition of Kobe's importance. Naval authorities regarded the port as a key node for ship repair and construction, as well as a transit point for military cargoes moving through the inland sea. Army staff, responsible for much of the homeland air defense, treated the Hanshin area as a priority zone, but faced shortages of modern fighters, radar sets, and heavy anti-aircraft guns. Local governments and business associations, meanwhile, attempted to strengthen civil defense. Companies organized in house fire brigades, installed water tanks on factory roofs, and trained workers in basic firefighting, while municipal departments expanded shelter construction and evacuation plans for non-essential civilians. Civil defense doctrine incorporated assumptions about how an air raid on Kobe would unfold. Officials expected that incendiary bombs would fall widely across residential districts and smaller workshops, while larger factories and port installations might receive a mix of high explosive and incendiaries. Plans called for neighborhood associations to form bucket brigades, for school buildings and dugout shelters to receive residents during alerts, and for tram and rail services to be halted when sirens sounded. At the same time, government ministries in Tokyo instructed local authorities to maintain production wherever possible, leading to a tension between evacuation, which reduced the number of hands available, and the demand to keep shipyards and factories operating under air threat. Propaganda and public information formed another dimension of planning on both sides. American leaders presented the growing air offensive as a way to hasten the end of the war and reduce the need for large-scale ground operations against the home islands, emphasizing attacks on industrial targets rather than individual civilians. Japanese information agencies, in contrast, downplayed the scale of early raids and emphasized themes of endurance and reconstruction, portraying air attacks as tests of national resilience. In Kobe, newspapers and radio broadcasts urged residents to comply with civil defense instructions and to remain at their posts unless directly ordered to evacuate, framing continued work in factories and at the docks as a contribution to national survival. By mid-March 1945, these various strands of planning converged on a specific operation. 21st Bomber Command scheduled Kobe to follow the major fire raids on Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, allowing crews to apply lessons learned about bomb patterns, timing, and navigation under night conditions. Japanese commanders expected further attacks after observing the destruction in other cities, and attempted to reposition fighters and anti-aircraft guns accordingly. Both sides thus entered the Kobe operation with clear strategic objectives, but also with incomplete information about how the interaction of incendiary loads, urban structure, weather, and defense would shape the outcome once the bombers approached the city. The main incendiary assault on Kobe began on the night of the 16th to 17th of March, 1945. Shortly after dusk, residents heard air raid sirens, followed by reports that a large formation of aircraft had crossed the coast. Above them, 331 B-29 bombers from all three wings of 21st Bomber Command moved toward pre-assigned approach points over the inland sea. Crews flew at night and at lower altitudes than in earlier high-level precision raids, with bomb bays filled primarily with clusters of M69 incendiary bomblets. Pathfinders equipped with radar and navigation aids moved ahead to mark the initial aiming points over the urban area. As the formation approached Kobe, Japanese air defense units activated searchlights and radar stations in the wider Hanshin region. Ground controllers attempted to vector fighters from nearby airfields onto the bomber streams. During the raid, observers on the American side recorded sighting around 280 Japanese fighters, of which roughly one-third made attacks on the bombers, often in single or small group passes. Anti-aircraft batteries around the port and inland fired barrages into the night sky. From the viewpoint of B-29 crews, the transit over the city involved a combined threat of tracer fire and fighters, but losses were limited to 3 aircraft whose causes of destruction could not be fully reconstructed afterward. Bomb release patterns were designed to create overlapping fields of incendiary impact. Initial waves concentrated on starting fires in 4 main sectors: the northwest urban districts, the areas south and north of the main rail line, and zones near the central station. Later, waves extended these belts outward. As clusters of incendiaries broke open at low altitude, bomblets fell into streets, factory yards, and residential compounds, penetrating roofs before igniting. Separate fires began to merge as wind carried flames and embers along rows of houses and workshops built from wood and light materials. On the ground, civil defense units moved according to established plans. Neighborhood associations deployed bucket brigades and hand pumps, while factory brigades attempted to defend workshops and warehouses with hoses, sand, and rooftop water tanks. Fire breaks created by earlier demolition of houses slowed the advance of some fire lines, but did not prevent them from crossing at multiple points. In many districts, the combination of dense construction, limited water pressure, and the speed of fire spread force teams to shift from active firefighting to guiding residents toward open spaces, canals, and embankments. For workers and families who had remained in the city despite evacuation programs, the raid presented a series of rapid decisions. Some individuals attempted to protect household goods or tools. Others concentrated on reaching school buildings, temples, or trench shelters. Railway and tram services halted, and people moved on foot through streets already affected by smoke and sparks. In port areas, dock workers and crews on moored vessels faced the risk of both fire and explosions from fuel stores and cargo, leading some ships to move into the harbor while others remained alongside burning quays. From the Japanese command perspective, the raid put existing assumptions about homeland air defense to the test. Radar and visual reports confirmed that a large bomber force could penetrate to Kobe at night, despite fighter opposition and anti-aircraft fire. Commanders collected initial data on the timing of sirens, the concentration of bombs, and the performance of civil defense units. However, the immediate priority remained containment of fires and restoration of basic services, limiting the ability to conduct detailed assessments while the attack was still in progress. In the hours after the B-29 formations turned back toward the Marianas, fires continued to burn across much of the designated target area. Surveys conducted in the following days indicated that roughly 3 square miles of built-up districts, amounting to about 21% of Kobe's urban area, had been destroyed or heavily damaged. Official counts recorded 8,841 confirmed dead, with many more injured and hundreds of thousands of residents lost homes or workplaces. For American planners, these figures suggested that the combination of night tactics, reduced altitude, and concentrated incendiary loads could produce extensive destruction in a major port city. For Japanese authorities, the same figures indicated that Kobe had moved from being a threatened but functioning industrial center to a city whose capacity to support shipbuilding, trade, and urban life had been substantially reduced by a single major operation. In the weeks after the March raid, Kobe entered a period of sustained strain rather than immediate recovery. Municipal authorities prioritized clearing main streets, restoring rail lines, and repairing port cranes, while leaving many residential districts as ruin belts. Temporary shelters were set up in schools, temples, and open spaces for residents who had lost homes. Industrial firms resumed work where buildings and machinery had survived, often under improvised roofing and with limited lighting. This partial restoration created a pattern in which the city functioned at reduced capacity, but remained exposed to further attacks that could strike both repaired and still damaged zones. American planning in the same period moved toward larger and more frequent incendiary operations against multiple cities. 21st Bomber Command evaluated the Kobe mission alongside raids on Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, concluding that concentrated night attacks at moderate altitude could reliably destroy extensive urban areas. Additional B-29 groups reached the Marianas, increasing the pool of available aircraft. Maintenance and logistics units refined turnaround procedures so that large forces could be launched in succession against different targets over several nights. Within this broader framework, Kobe retained its status as a key port and industrial center that would likely be revisited once other cities had been struck. On the Japanese side, the March raid triggered debates about how to allocate scarce defensive resources. Air defense commanders considered reinforcing the Hanshin region with more fighters and heavy anti-aircraft guns, but the same units were also requested to protect Tokyo, Nagoya, and regional industrial clusters. The result was a compromise, some redeployment of guns and searchlights to Kobe and Osaka, but no fundamental increase in the total number of aircraft available for interception. Civil defense leaders pressed for further house demolitions to expand fire breaks. Yet these measures displaced additional residents and added to urban congestion in remaining districts, complicating evacuation routes. Evacuation policy itself moved into a crisis phase. Central authorities had already promoted the relocation of schoolchildren and non-essential dependents in 1944, but after the March firebombings in several cities, pressure grew to widen the program. In Kobe, families who had previously chosen to remain together now faced the choice of sending children to rural areas or keeping them in a city that might be targeted again. Factories that relied on young workers resisted large-scale departures, arguing that loss of labor would slow ship repair and production. This tension between safety and output produced a patchwork pattern. Some neighborhoods saw a marked decline in population, while others remained crowded with workers tied to port and industrial employment. Economically, the cumulative impact of air raids around the inland sea produced bottlenecks that extended beyond city limits. Kobe's role as a shipping and transshipment point meant that damage to warehouses, rail yards, and dockside facilities disrupted the flow of coal, steel, and finished goods between regions. Coastal shipping, already under pressure from submarine and air attack, faced delays and rerouting when cargoes could not be handled at normal capacity. Japanese planners attempted to compensate by diverting some traffic to less damaged ports and by increasing overland rail shipments, but fuel shortages and track damage elsewhere limited the scope of these adjustments. For civilians, the escalation of the air war generated a climate of recurring alerts and uncertainty. Nights without raids were still marked by siren tests, blackout enforcement, and the sight of searchlights probing the sky when radar or visual observers reported possible incoming aircraft. Factories and dockyards organized shifts around the likelihood of raids, sometimes keeping workers on site overnight to ensure immediate firefighting response. At the same time, food supply became more precarious as production and transport were disrupted. Rationing, already strict, tightened further, and residents in damaged districts depended increasingly on communal kitchens and relief distributions. In American headquarters, assessments of Japanese morale and production fed into discussions about whether continued bombing might provoke political shifts or primarily degrade military capacity. Intelligence officers interpreted reports of evacuations, urban damage, and food shortages as indicators that the combined effect of blockade and air attack was eroding the ability of Japanese cities to support war industries. However, they also noted that industrial dispersal continued, with some workshops relocating to rural areas or underground sites, which could reduce the immediate impact of urban destruction on certain sectors. International responses to the intensification of bombing were limited but present. Allied governments generally accepted area raids on Japanese cities as part of the overall strategy to compel surrender, drawing parallels with previous campaigns against German industrial centers. Neutral observers, including diplomats from non-belligerent states stationed in Tokyo, compiled reports on the condition of Japanese cities and transmitted them to their capitals, noting both the scale of physical damage and the persistence of government control. These external perspectives did not directly alter operations over Kobe, but they formed part of the wider informational context in which strategic air decisions were made. By late May 1945, both sides confronted an escalating crisis. For Japan, repeated large raids on major cities and mounting shipping losses raised questions about how long industrial production and urban society could be sustained. For the United States, the availability of more B-29s and refined incendiary tactics created the capability for even larger operations. Within this setting, Kobe's partially restored port, surviving industrial facilities, and remaining residential districts presented both a symbol of Japanese resilience and a target that, if struck again on a larger scale, could further reduce the country's capacity to move goods and maintain urban life. The peak of the air campaign against Kobe came in June 1945, when the city was subjected to further large-scale raids that built directly on the experience of March. By this stage, 21st Bomber Command could assemble forces of several hundred B-29s for single-night operations, drawing on expanded airfields and maintenance capacity in the Marianas. Mission planners integrated Kobe into a wider sequence of attacks on Osaka, Nagoya, and other targets around the inland sea, aiming to exert continuous pressure on Japan's remaining industrial and transport centers rather than isolated blows. One of the heaviest raids on Kobe took place on June 5, 1945. A force of more than 400 B-29s was dispatched, again equipped predominantly with incendiary munitions. Tactics followed the pattern refined in previous months. Night approach at moderate altitude, use of radar-equipped pathfinders to identify the target area, and concentration of bomb drops in overlapping patterns to generate contiguous burn zones. The designated aiming areas included districts that had partly escaped destruction in March, as well as sections of the port and industrial belt where repairs and makeshift reconstruction were underway. Japanese air defenses responded with the available means. Fighter units, constrained by fuel shortages and earlier losses, could only mount limited interceptions, often attacking in small groups. Anti-aircraft batteries opened sustained fire, particularly around port facilities and key infrastructure, but could not prevent the bomber stream from maintaining formation over the target. From the perspective of B-29 crews, the raid involved heavier flak concentrations than some earlier missions, but resulted in relatively few losses compared with the number of aircraft committed. For Kobe's defenders, the June operation confirmed that the scale of American air power now exceeded the capacity of local defenses to prevent repeated large raids. On the ground, the June attack extended the zones of destruction created in March. Fires once again broke out in residential quarters and industrial districts, this time starting not only in intact neighborhoods but also in buildings erected or patched together in the months after the first major raid. Warehouses, sheds, and temporary structures that had been added to maintain production now contributed additional fuel for the fires. Railway yards, tram lines, and road junctions suffered renewed damage, complicating movement across the city. Port areas saw further loss of sheds, cranes, and key installations, reducing Kobe's ability to handle cargo even when ships and rail links were available. For workers in shipyards, machine plants, and transport services, the June raid coincided with already high levels of fatigue and disruption. Many had been operating under extended hours to meet production targets despite shortages of materials and parts. Air raid drills, nighttime alerts, and participation in factory fire brigades added further demands. When incendiaries fell on or near their workplaces, crews had to decide whether to remain at firefighting posts or withdraw to shelters and open spaces. In some plants, managers organized rotations so that part of the workforce concentrated on protecting key machinery, while others assisted families in nearby residential blocks. Kobe's medical and relief services reached their limits during this phase. Hospitals and clinics that had survived earlier attacks operated with reduced staff and supplies, treating burns, blast injuries, and smoke inhalation cases from multiple districts. Improvised aid stations appeared in schools and temples, staffed by nurses, students, and volunteers. The city administration coordinated burial teams, clearance crews, and the distribution of food and clothing, but transport difficulties and damage to communication lines slowed these efforts. The combined effect of repeated raids, shortages, and displacement made it increasingly difficult to maintain systematic records of casualties and property loss in real time. At the level of Japanese Central Command, reports from Kobe and other cities contributed to a broader picture of cumulative urban damage. Ministries responsible for munitions, transport, and home affairs compiled data on destroyed workshops, disrupted supply chains, and the number of evacuees. These figures intersected with military assessments of Japan's capacity to continue large-scale operations in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. While no single raid on Kobe determined national policy, the city's experience formed part of a pattern in which multiple industrial and port centers were degraded within a few months. American assessments of the June raids treated Kobe as a case study in the effectiveness of sustained incendiary bombing against a major port city with mixed industrial and residential districts. Aerial photography and post-strike analysis indicated that a high proportion of the remaining built-up area within the designated target zones had been burned. Analysts noted reductions in visible shipbuilding and repair activity, increased wreckage around docks, and a decline in night lighting, which they associated with power shortages and damage to distribution networks. These findings supported the view that continued air operations could further restrict Japan's ability to move resources and maintain industrial output, even before any invasion of the home islands. By mid-June 1945, therefore, Kobe had passed through the most intense phase of the bombing campaign. The March and June raids, together with smaller attacks and alerts, had transformed the city from a dense urban industrial hub into a patchwork of ruin belts, surviving factory islands, and overburdened infrastructure. Both Japanese and American command structures recognized that Kobe's role in the war economy had been sharply reduced, but they also understood that remaining workshops, rail links, and port sections still contributed to national logistics. This combination of severe damage and residual function framed the forms of resistance and adaptation that would characterize the final months of the war in and around the city. In the final months of the war, resistance and adaptation in Kobe took forms shaped less by organized armed opposition and more by attempts to preserve basic functions of urban life under sustained air attack. Municipal authorities, factory managers, and neighborhood leaders worked within the shrinking margins left by damage, shortages, and central directives, while American planners adjusted their own methods based on what they observed in the city and other targets. One axis of adaptation in Kobe was the further dispersal of industry. Workshops that could be moved relocated machinery to rural districts or small towns along rail lines, using school buildings, warehouses, or improvised sheds as production sites. Some firms divided operations into several small units to reduce the risk of total loss from a single raid. For heavier industries tied to shipbuilding and large machine tools, dispersal was limited. Instead, managers focused on concentrating resources on selected lines of work judged most important, such as ship repair for military and essential merchant vessels, and abandoning less critical output. Civil defense structures adapted as well. After the major raids, neighborhood associations revised their firefighting tactics, placing greater emphasis on early detection and containment of small fires before they could spread into larger belts of destruction. Training sessions focused on recognizing different types of incendiary devices, handling unexploded bomblets, and coordinating between household, street, and block-level teams. In districts that still had standing buildings, residents reinforced water storage, dug additional trenches, and cleared obstacles from routes leading to open spaces, riversides, and embankments. Evacuation patterns reflected both policy and individual decisions. The central government continued to promote the relocation of school children and non-essential residents, but by mid-1945, transport disruptions and rural capacity limits made large new movements difficult. In Kobe, some families sent younger members to relatives in the countryside, while older workers remained near factories and docks. Others chose to stay together despite repeated raids, valuing proximity to work or fearing uncertainty in rural areas with scarce food. This produced a layered population, core groups tied to industrial and port functions, and shifting numbers of evacuees moving in and out of the city as circumstances changed. Adaptation also took place in the sphere of everyday economic life. With formal distribution systems under strain, informal exchanges and small markets emerged in less damaged districts and at the edges of the city. Residents traded clothing, tools, and household items for food brought from rural areas. Factory workers occasionally carried goods along these networks, supplementing ration allocations. Authorities attempted to regulate such activity through price controls and patrols, but could not fully suppress it, and these channels became part of how households coped with the combined effects of bombing, shortages, and inflation. Psychological responses varied across groups. Many residents experienced repeated nights in shelters, long walks through ruined areas, and uncertainty about relatives in other cities. Some interpreted air raids as confirmation that the war had entered a phase in which urban centers would bear the main burden, reinforcing a sense of obligation to continue working in critical industries. Others reacted by intensifying religious observances, participating in community events, or withdrawing into family circles. For children who remained in Kobe, schooling shifted to shorter hours, lessons in makeshift classrooms, and participation in civil defense duties such as water bucket lines and salvage work. Japanese military and civil commands attempted to maintain discipline and order under these conditions. Regulations prescribed penalties for looting, desertion from assigned workplaces, and failure to comply with civil defense instructions. Patrols monitored blackout observance and the use of shelters. At the same time, officials were aware that over-reliance on coercion could undermine cooperation, and many measures relied on appeals to collective responsibility, emphasizing the importance of each neighborhood's contribution to fire prevention and reconstruction. On the American side, resistance and adaptation were reflected in the continuous refinement of bombing tactics. Analysis of post-strike photographs of Kobe and other cities informed decisions about bomb mix, aiming points, and timing. crews received updated briefings on enemy fighter tactics and anti-aircraft patterns in the Hanshin area. Modifications to B-29s, including adjustments to engine cooling and fuel management, were intended to reduce in-flight failures on long missions to targets like Kobe. Training emphasized navigation and radar use in coastal regions where smoke and cloud could obscure visual landmarks. Air crew and ground personnel also faced cumulative psychological and physical strain. Long missions to Kobe involved hours over open water, concentrated periods of flak and potential fighter engagement, and the demands of night assembly and debriefing. Casualty rates on any single raid might be limited, but repeated operations produce losses spread over time. Within units, informal support networks, rotation policies, and periods of rest on the Marianas provided mechanisms for managing fatigue, while official reports and decorations recorded individual and collective performance. By late summer 1945, the interaction of these forms of resistance and adaptation had created a complex picture. Kobe no longer functioned as the integrated port and industrial center it had been earlier in the war, yet it still contained pockets of active production, transport, and community life. Japanese authorities continued to adjust civil defense, evacuation, and industrial dispersal, even as resources diminished. American planners continued to calibrate bombing patterns and assess the city's remaining strategic value. The capacity of both sides to adapt under pressure shaped the conditions in which the final turning points of the war would reach Kobe and its inhabitants. The turning point for Kobe did not come through a single raid on the city, but through a combination of national-level decisions and the cumulative effects of blockade and bombing in mid-1945. By early summer, Japanese planners recognized that the country's merchant fleet had shrunk from nearly 6 million gross tons at the start of the war to well under half that figure, with many surviving ships damaged or short of fuel. Aerial mining operations, including extensive mine laying in the approaches to the inland sea and ports such as Kobe, further restricted movement. Even where quays and warehouses remained usable, ships risked striking mines in harbors and coastal channels, reducing the practical value of restored port facilities. From the American perspective, this shift in Japan's logistical position altered the relative importance of individual cities. Kobe remained on the target list, but the main strategic focus moved toward ensuring that remaining transport routes were cut, and that national leadership understood the scale of destruction already inflicted. Mining operations against shipping, continued incendiary raids on selected cities, and preparations for a possible invasion of Kyushu were combined into a broader strategy aimed at exhausting Japan's capacity and will to continue the war. In this framework, Kobe's earlier devastation was seen as part of a completed phase of the campaign, rather than the main focus of new operations. Inside Kobe, the turning point was experienced as a gradual transition from frequent large raids to more intermittent alerts and smaller-scale attacks. While living conditions continued to deteriorate, the reduction in major bombing after the June raids did not mean a return to pre-war routines. Food stocks remained tight, transport was unreliable, and many residents still lived in temporary shelters or crowded remaining houses. Air raid warnings continued whenever aircraft were detected, but nights sometimes passed without bombs falling on the city itself. For civilians, this created a sense of suspended threat. The memory of earlier destruction, combined with uncertainty about whether further large raids would occur. At the national command level in Japan, the loss of industrial centers, port capacity, and shipping, including Kobe's facilities, fed into discussions about how to respond to the unfolding crisis. Reports on the condition of the Hanshin region documented burned districts, disrupted supply lines, and the limited output of remaining factories. These reports were considered alongside information from other cities, frontline operations, and the state of fuel reserves. While some leaders argued for continuing the war in the hope of negotiating better terms, others pointed to the cumulative impact of air attacks and blockade as evidence that Japan's position was becoming untenable. In August 1945, the situation shifted decisively. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th of August demonstrated a new level of destructive capability directed at Japanese cities. Although Kobe was not targeted with atomic weapons, residents learned of the events through official announcements, rumors, and reports from people with connections to the affected regions. At approximately the same time, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan by attacking forces in Manchuria, opening a new front that Japanese planners had long feared. These developments altered the strategic context in which the damage to Kobe and other cities was assessed. For American air planners, the use of atomic bombs and the rapid advance of Soviet forces raised the question of whether continued large-scale conventional bombing of cities like Kobe remained necessary. P-29 units remained ready to conduct further incendiary and mining operations, but attention increasingly turned to monitoring Japan's political responses and preparing for possible surrender, or, if necessary, additional atomic strikes. Kobe's already reduced industrial and port capacity meant that further conventional attacks on the city offered diminishing returns compared with other options for applying pressure. In Kobe itself, the turning point was registered through changes in official messaging and public atmosphere. Radio broadcasts and newspapers, which had long emphasized endurance under air attack and the importance of continued production, began to carry more frequent references to the need for unity in the face of new weapons and shifting front lines. Civil defense drills continued, but there was growing recognition that the pattern of war that had brought incendiary raids and mining to Kobe was now part of a larger transformation in Japan's overall situation. Residents and officials alike awaited indications of how national leaders would respond. The announcement of Japan's intention to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration on August 15, 1945, provided the formal marker of the turning point at the national level. For Kobe, this decision meant that the threat of further large raids receded, and that the city's remaining port and industrial facilities would no longer be targets of deliberate attack. At the same time, the damage already sustained, the loss of shipping, and the disruption of supply lines ensured that hardship would continue. The end of bombing did not immediately restore normal economic activity, but it did change the framework within which recovery, occupation, and relief would proceed. Thus, the turning point in Kobe's wartime experience combined local and national elements. Locally, the heaviest destruction had already occurred by June 1945, and the city's ability to function as an industrial port was sharply reduced. Nationally, the combination of cumulative bombing, blockade, atomic attacks, and Soviet entry into the war led to a decision to surrender, which removed Kobe from the list of active targets and opened the way for a different kind of interaction with American forces. The transition from active bombardment to preparation for occupation set the stage for the immediate aftermath that residents, administrators, and former combatants would confront in the weeks and months following the cessation of hostilities. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, combat operations over Kobe ceased, but the effects of earlier bombing and blockade remained visible in every sector of city life. No further large raids struck the urban area after mid-August 1945, and American air units shifted from offensive missions to supply drops and reconnaissance. For residents, the absence of sirens and bomb blasts marked a clear break with the preceding months. Yet the city's landscape still consisted of extended ruin belts, damaged infrastructure, and provisional shelters. The formal end of hostilities removed the threat of new attacks, but did not immediately resolve shortages of food, fuel, and medical supplies. Administrative control in Kobe passed through a transitional phase. Japanese municipal authorities continued to perform day-to-day functions, including ration distribution, debris clearance, and basic policing, but they now operated under the broader framework of surrender and impending Allied occupation. Central ministries issued directives on preserving records, stabilizing public order, and preparing for the arrival of foreign forces. At the same time, local officials had to address urgent problems. Thousands of residents remained homeless, water and electricity services were irregular, and transport networks were only partially restored. The balance between following national instructions and responding to neighborhood-level needs became a central feature of post-war governance in the city. The arrival of Allied occupation forces in the Kansai region introduced a new layer of authority. Units of the United States Army and supporting services moved into key ports and urban centers, including Kobe and nearby Osaka, to oversee demilitarization, supervise the handover of facilities, and facilitate the movement of personnel and materials. In Kobe, port installations, warehouses, and some surviving industrial plants were inspected, cataloged, and in some cases requisitioned for Allied use. Japanese military equipment stored in or near the city was surrendered and collected, while naval and army units complied with orders to disarm and disband. This process transformed Kobe from a logistical node for Japanese operations into a site integrated into Allied supply and administrative networks. For civilians, the presence of occupation forces brought both constraints and opportunities. On one hand, regulations governing movement, curfews, and the use of certain facilities were introduced or modified under Allied supervision. On the other, the reopening of port activity under occupation control created limited employment possibilities in stevedoring, repair work, and service roles supporting the new authorities. Former shipyard and dock workers sometimes shifted to tasks related to clearing wreckage, refurbishing berths, or assisting with the unloading of relief supplies and military equipment. These activities contributed to the gradual reactivation of Kobe's harbor, albeit under a different strategic framework than during the war. Humanitarian consequences of the bombing and blockade remained significant in the first months after surrender. Malnutrition, illness, and inadequate housing affected large segments of the population. Relief efforts included distributions of food and medicine organized by Japanese authorities, with oversight and supplementation from Allied agencies. International organizations and foreign governments contributed supplies, which reached Kobe through the re-established shipping routes. Schools and public buildings continued to serve as temporary housing and feeding centers until more permanent arrangements could be developed. Medical personnel, many of whom had worked throughout the bombing period, now faced the dual tasks of treating ongoing health problems and conducting surveys to understand the full extent of war-related damage. The social fabric of Kobe underwent visible changes during this time. Families separated by evacuation or military service attempted to reunite, using limited communication channels and transport. Return flows from rural areas brought some evacuees back to the city, even as housing stock remained insufficient. Former conscripts and demobilized personnel re-entered civilian life, seeking employment in a damaged economy where pre-war positions no longer existed, or where workplaces had been destroyed. Community organizations that had previously focused on civil defense and neighborhood firefighting began to redirect their activities toward reconstruction, mutual aid, and the negotiation of new relationships with municipal and occupation authorities. Economically, the withdrawal from wartime production and the shift toward peace presented complex challenges. Industries that had served military contracts had to reorient or suspend operations, while policies on reparations, industrial limits, and trade were formulated at national and Allied levels. Kobe's shipyards and machine plants, where functional, explored the possibilities of repair and construction work for civilian shipping, but these efforts were constrained by material shortages and the need to comply with occupation directives. Small workshops and merchants reopened in surviving districts, forming the nucleus of a post-war local economy characterized by modest scale and improvisation. The physical process of clearing and rebuilding proceeded unevenly. Debris removal focused first on major thoroughfares, port access routes, and sites selected for essential services. Residential reconstruction was slower, limited by shortages of timber, tools, and skilled labor. Some families built simple dwellings on or near former house plots, while others remained in communal facilities for extended periods. Urban planners and engineers in Kobe and at higher administrative levels began to consider how to redesign fire-damaged areas to reduce future vulnerability, but immediate priorities often dictated temporary solutions rather than comprehensive redevelopment. In this phase, the legacy of bombing shaped daily experience as much as formal political decisions. The withdrawal of active combat operations and the transition to occupation meant that Kobe was no longer a target in an ongoing campaign. Yet the consequences of earlier raids, mining, and blockade continued to influence living conditions, economic activity, and urban structure. The city's inhabitants, administrators, and the new Allied authorities all had to operate within the constraints imposed by the destruction while beginning to define the terms of post-war recovery. In the long term, the bombing of Kobe became part of a broader historical pattern in which strategic air campaigns reshaped both physical landscapes and interpretations of modern war. Within Japan, the destruction of Kobe's port and industrial districts contributed to the post-war understanding that the country's defeat had been produced not only by naval and land battles, but also by the systematic erosion of urban economic capacity. The raids on Kobe, combined with attacks on other cities, demonstrated how industrial dispersal, shipping logistics, and urban vulnerability were interconnected, and how air power could translate those connections into concrete limits on a nation's ability to continue fighting. Politically, Kobe's experience influenced post-war debates in Japan about rearmament, civil defense, and the role of cities in national strategy. The memory of firebombing contributed to support for constitutional limits on military forces and for policies that emphasized diplomacy and economic reconstruction over large-scale offensive capabilities. At the municipal level, rebuilding plans incorporated wider streets, zoning changes, and improved water systems intended to reduce the risk of uncontrolled urban fires. These measures were framed not only as responses to past raids, but also as part of a broader modernization effort that linked Kobe's future to trade, industry, and urban services rather than to direct military functions. Internationally, the bombing of Kobe formed one case among many in discussions about the legitimacy and effectiveness of area bombing. Military analysts pointed to the city as evidence that concentrated incendiary attacks could severely disrupt industrial production, transport, and morale, especially when combined with blockade and mining. Critics, including some later historians and legal scholars, focused on the impact on civilians and the difficulty of clearly separating industrial targets from densely populated residential districts in port cities. Kobe's mixed character as an industrial hub, transport node, and residential center made it a frequent reference point in arguments about whether and how air campaigns against cities should be constrained in future conflicts. Culturally, Kobe's wartime destruction was integrated into local and national narratives through memorials, museums, literature, and public ceremonies. Commemorative practices often highlighted the experiences of residents who lived through the raids, the efforts of firefighters and medical personnel, and the long process of rebuilding neighborhoods. At the same time, these narratives were set within a larger Japanese reflection on war responsibility, defeat, and reconstruction. Kobe's story was linked to that of other cities, reinforcing a collective memory in which urban communities bore a significant share of the war's human and material cost. From an economic perspective, the city's post-war trajectory illustrated both the lasting effects of bombing and the capacity for recovery under new conditions. Kobe eventually re-emerged as a major port in the context of Japan's rapid economic growth in the 1950s and 1960s. But its rebuilt infrastructure reflected changes in technology, trade patterns, and regulatory frameworks that had been shaped in part by wartime experience. The earlier dependence on closely packed wooden housing and small inner-city workshops gave way to more diversified industrial zones, container facilities, and expanded suburban areas, altering the relationship between port functions and residential life. In historical scholarship, the bombing of Kobe has been analyzed in several overlapping frameworks. Operational studies examine the planning, execution, and results of the March and June 1945 raids, comparing them to attacks on other Japanese cities and to European campaigns, such as those against Hamburg or Dresden. Social historians focus on the daily lives of civilians before, during, and after the raids, reconstructing patterns of evacuation, shelter use, work, and family adaptation. Urban and economic historians explore how wartime damage influenced post-war planning, land use, and industrial structure. These different perspectives have produced a layered understanding in which no single interpretation exhausts the event's meaning. The bombing's legacy also extends into contemporary debates on air power and civilian protection. Kobe's experience is cited in discussions about whether technological advances in targeting and intelligence have fundamentally changed the balance between military advantage and civilian risk, or whether densely populated urban areas remain inherently vulnerable when used as industrial and logistical hubs. Comparisons between mid-20th century incendiary campaigns and later operations using different munitions encourage analysts to consider continuity and change in doctrines governing attacks on infrastructure embedded in cities. For the inhabitants of Kobe, however, the legacy is not only a matter of strategic or legal analysis. It is reflected in urban spaces where older residents remember former neighborhoods now rebuilt in different forms, in local histories that document how specific streets, schools, or factories were affected, and in annual acts of remembrance that connect past destruction with contemporary concerns about disaster preparedness. The city's experience of wartime bombing is thus both a distinct historical episode and part of a wider reflection on vulnerability to fire, earthquake, and other hazards that has shaped Kobe's identity. Taken together, these dimensions give the bombing of Kobe a lasting historical significance that extends beyond the immediate military context of 1945. The raids formed one element in the final phase of the Pacific War, contributing to the cumulative pressure on Japan's war economy and transport system. At the same time, they reshaped a major port city's physical structure, social fabric, and political choices in the decades that followed. The ways in which Kobe was destroyed, rebuilt, and remembered continue to inform scholarly debates, public memory, and policy discussions about the conduct of war and the resilience of urban societies under extreme strain.